All right. It's anti-Semite time. Welcome to the Chris Spangle Show. Thanks so much for joining me here on the program. And today we are going to wade into anti-Semitism. There's a lot of it going around. It doesn't matter if it's on the left or the right. Today we're talking, I don't know where this guy falls, but I don't know how many of you watch Tucker Carlson's podcast, but he had a guy on by the name of Daryl Cooper, who is Martyr Made. I know of the podcast. Somebody actually sent me a couple of his podcasts and said to listen to him. I think he's the co-host to Jocko Willink, or he's involved in his podcast somehow, and then has his own history podcasts. I'm gonna just be honest with you. I don't know a ton about this guy. I watched a good chunk of the 2-hour and 18-minute podcast with Tucker Carlson, and it's making a lot of waves right now on X, because that's where it aired, about his comments over Hitler and over, we'll get into it. We'll hear it. First thing is, if we're going to make fun of Tim Wall's weird hand movements, this guy has the creepiest, weirdest little hand movements. I know that's very stupid to criticize him on, but I was just, as I was watching it last night, thinking, this is, if we're going to make fun of Tim Walz, this is the same kind of weird hand movements. Are we going to start claiming he has neurological diseases too? Yeah, so I was on Twitter last night, and I saw a Churchillian, it was a guy from Hillsdale, actually. And if you don't know Hillsdale, it's a conservative college up in Michigan that is very steeped in the founding and very conservative. And he was saying, I'm going to deal with this. This is crazy. How dare you besmirch Churchill? And I love Winston Churchill. I know he has a huge amount of problems, like his racism. He's he hated Gandhi. There's a lot of problems. In our own time, he would be far more racist if you took his words than people consider Tucker Carlson to be. But Winston Churchill, I'll read something to you after this. Let's kind of talk about it. Let's wade into it. I'm going to play you some of this so you understand the context of what is being talked about, because I think a lot of times you see a headline on some website or social media, it says Tucker Carlson has a Nazi apologist on. All right. Well, I see that stuff all the time, and I sort of go, well, maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. I don't know that I trust the Daily Mail or the Daily Beast to give me that information. Let me go watch it for myself. And I think you have to do that. When it comes to right-wing figures, you always have to go, well, let's check in with Candace Owens and see if she's really being anti-Semitic. Oh, my God, she's being anti-Semitic. Wow. And Tucker Carlson, I think, has been flirting with the line of anti-Semitism for a while. And I think this is a feature of the new right. They have become steeped in right-wing European politics, which, hilariously, Winston Churchill was a part of. But in order to be anti-war, they are now using revisionist history to say, well, we can't do this because this comes from that, and NATO comes from the international order that was created by Winston Churchill and FDR, and therefore it's the fruit of the poisonous tree, so therefore it's bad all the way down, and we need to question everything about World War II, which has always been a huge part of the racist right. I mean, going back and saying, well, did Hitler made the trains run on time? And why can't you ask questions about the Jews? Now I've seen all day, why can't you ask questions about World War II? Well, people have been writing and creating documentaries about World War II and discussing every little minute aspect of it for 80 years now. And, Pat Buchanan wrote a book questioning, why did World War II happen? It happened because of these Western diplomats, which sounds a lot like, well, NATO caused the Russian invasion, which is nonsense. But you can absolutely question World War II. You can question a lot of these things. But what he's really getting at, if you hop back before the clip that everybody's pulling, which I'm going to do. I'm not going to play this piece, but you hear him in this, Daryl Cooper talking to Tucker Carlson, say, why can't you question these things? Why can't you? And this is the big thing, is I'm going to question something I know that will make you angry, and your anger, therefore, is evidence of me being correct. And if you're scrolling X or Twitter, you see a lot of this. Like, the anger that this is producing clearly proves that he's right, that questioning this is the right thing. That's not necessarily true. You push the button knowing that you were going to get a certain reaction from a lot of people. That doesn't prove you're right. It's sort of like debating someone and then going, I won. Well, maybe you didn't definitively win. But it's a very common tactic on the new right now, is to asking questions, man. And that's Tucker Carlson's thing, always just asking questions, and sometimes the questions need to be asked, and sometimes the questions are revisionist history based on settled fact. But I'm going to start with this Daryl Cooper interview at a place I actually really do agree with him on. When you're reading history or you're examining politics, he makes a really important point in how you have to think about these things.
I felt like I knew this guy.
He's talking about Jim Jones. He'd listened to a lot of stuff.
And their tapes, by the way, they're not all from like 1 year. They're from like 15, 20 years, right? So you can watch this process of a descent into madness as it's happening. And, to get to a point where you can bring yourself to step into the shoes of any other human being and understand that as much as it makes you uncomfortable, it is just a human being. And at the very, very like base level, their motivations are the same as yours. Their needs are the same as yours. But that we're a multivariate species that can go a lot of different directions. Right. And to be able to do that and force yourself to do it is the key. And so when you do something like that with, again, like a historical event like World War II, where, the one rule is that you shall not do that. You shall not look at this topic and try to understand how the Germans saw the world.
He's talking about Weimar culture. It's a big thing in the alt-right, new right, European right. Weimar culture was very gay and decadent and had no purpose. And they're essentially using the Hitlerian critique of Weimar culture, and we're broke because of all of these gay people in Berlin, and so therefore the Jews and the gays need to be eradicated so we can get back to a wholesome trad culture, right? So if you can ever question that and talk about Weimar as anything other than just this utopian ideal of arts and culture, well, why can't you ask those questions? That's the subtext of what he's saying, that anybody who follows this stuff understands what he's saying, but it just on the surface sounds like, yeah, why can't you ask any question you want?
Like how the whole thing from the First World War on up.
Now, I agree with him in that you have to think about politicians like Joe Biden, not as this evil man who's a leader of a cabal, but somebody that is working out this decision to drop out of the race and dealing with tough emotions around it and their own mortality, right? Nancy Pelosi has her own set of personal calculations. People tend to operate from their own selfishness and their own, emotional stability, right? Like, I think therapy has been really important for me to train my brain to make good decisions, to break a lot of cycles, right? But some people do that, some people don't. Adolf Hitler had his own set of assumptions that he was operating from, and you can try to understand those, but he was evil. And anytime you invoke empathy, this is sort of the funny thing about a lot of these guys, right? We need to understand and ask questions and see things through the lens of other people and through their emotional experience. And erase and just introduce gray. and erase the black and white lines of murdering 6 million Jews. And was that even the number? Right? There's always this appeal for understanding and empathy towards them and what they think is important, but then absolutely none going the other direction. So, if you believe that Winston Churchill was the savior of Western civilization, which is true, and hilarious that guys who talk a lot about Western civilization don't like Winston Churchill, but you can take that empathy too far and start to rewrite history in a way that becomes empathetic of evil, because you want the justification for your own actions and your own beliefs, which is really how a lot of this is coded to me, and why I saw it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, because everything I've seen about this Daryl Cooper guy, is a lot of people respect him. He's the new Dan Carlin. He is not the new Dan Carlin after watching this. I saw Al Mohler and Richard Hanania, who has his own white supremacist problems. Owen Strachan, who's a hardcore conservative right-wing pastor. I mean, I saw so many people on the right, not the usual Bulwark Dispatch suspects. They, of course, denounced it. But, members of the new right going, hey, this is too far. So, of course, I wanted to check it out and watch it. But, I think when you listen to this piece, I'm going to frame it for you, but, are we trying to understand the mentality of Germans in the interwar period? I think we should absolutely do that. But he completely misses the fact that they were manipulated by propaganda to believe a certain way. So check this out.
To the very end of the war, how these people might have genuinely felt like they were the ones under attack, that they were the ones being victimized by their neighbors and by all these by the Allied powers.
Right. Who made them think that way?
And you can handle that.
You could easily say at this point, remember COVID? This is why we've got to avoid propaganda and the convergence of fascism into one. And that's usually not the interpretation that a lot of people on the new right have. They go, we need to build our own hammer so we can hammer them first, as opposed to the libertarian view, which is reduce the size and scope of the hammer and the ability to actually nail anybody.
With a sentence, you can wave it off and say, well, they're justifying themselves or they're rationalizing their evil or whatever you want to say. But again, I think we're getting to the point where that's very unsatisfying for people.
Most of us, well, actually all of us, go through our daily.
All right. So, it's unsatisfying. We need to ask the hard questions and the deep questions. And I'm all for asking questions, but at the same time, I think people are so seduced by conspiracy thinking because they want to be contrarian. They want to be in on secret knowledge. If you're a conspiracy theorist, usually it's a form of narcissism. I'm so important in the world, despite all the evidence of that being true, that they are trying to control my life because I can change it. Right? Now, I think you can have a lot of effect in your local community, your family group, your friend group, through starting businesses, through starting nonprofits. But this idea that we all had at 16 that we're going to change the world is not true, right? There's very few great men of history. So I forget what my point was. But yes, the constant questioning, to me, is a way of self-soothing. It is a person who is trying to find significance in the world because they don't feel that they have enough. Their identity is shaky. And so they go all in and believe anything that dumbasses like this guy say. So I do think we need to be skeptical. We need to ask questions. But we also need to remember that sometimes these people are lying to manipulate us for their own political ends. And where they're going is really ugly. When you look at Daryl Cooper's tweets, and you can go on Twitter and find a million people talking about this stuff, but there's a ton of tweets of him. Like, it was Hitler standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, and then the opening ceremonies with the fat blue guy, right? And, basically saying that culture was better than this culture. Like, how do you interpret that? And then another quote unquote joke about how Hitler was in heaven. So, like, Kyle Rittenhouse's shooting victims were in hell looking for Hitler, and he wasn't there. So, like, how do you not? I mean, I'm always trying to give people a generous interpretation, but he's just being provocative. He's in the media. He's just trying to be provocative. Man, I've seen this for 10 years. I was in all these libertarian brutalist groups 10 years ago, and we talked a lot about it on the show because it was always like inside jokes. Jeffrey Tucker wrote against the libertarian brutalism and then eventually morphed into one, but basically saying, like, we need to appeal to people's empathy and their best nature and be hopeful, as opposed to, like, just getting the kecks by this behavior that is always inflammatory. And Michael Cloud in the 80s and 90s had something called the Great Macho Flash, where you're trying to get attention by being a derelict human being, and so we need to stop it because it turns people off to libertarianism, and so be a good person, blah blah blah. All the Macho Flash has basically taken over the movement again, and any kind of winsomeness is gone, which is why people don't want to be libertarian. When they look at it, they go, I don't want to be libertarian because I don't want these people to have any kind of say. I wouldn't want to sign a voluntary contract with this person in a neighborhood because they have no love for other people. So let's get back to this conversation, okay? So there's limits to just asking questions, right? Eventually, the jokes. The jokes were always, because they're censoring free speech, we need to make anti-Semitic and racist jokes in these Facebook groups, and the person who comes up with the most offensive jokes wins. And of course, all my co-hosts back then won, because I surrounded myself with a lot of people who, I don't know, I won't go into it. But the jokes people, the just jokes people, all ended up being Nazis. It's really crazy because they would say, I'm just joking. This is just a joke. Can't you take a joke? And then eventually they were like in charge of the White Knights of Arkansas. Like, okay, maybe you weren't joking. Where I think I had a very different shift. I leaned into my Christianity as opposed to using it as a cultural crutch. And I think Christ calls us to be positionally Christ-like as much as we are. So I leaned into my Christianity and went a different route, as opposed to kind of looking at it like we need to rebuild a Christian culture. I view like my job to be more winsome and understanding of people. And I think I went a totally different direction than a lot of libertarians over the last 10 years, because I see liberalism, capitalism, democracy as important tools, and equality just comes along with it because it's the most loving position. And in terms of how we position ourselves and how we approach the people we disagree with, Christ feels that is as important as what policy position you hold. And so it's not enough to just have the correct policy positions. You also have to communicate that in a way that makes people understand that you're not just trying to be mean, right? Like, I think there is a huge opportunity for more Christians to think winsomely about politics than we are. So I just got tired of the jokes and thought, the jokes are funny if they're jokes, but a lot of people are not joking, and racism is really unbiblical and ugly, and you're grouping all people into a category and then dismissing. It's decidedly unlibertarian. And I think you can make jokes if you're within the friend group, but I think if you're using the jokes to try and advance a political agenda, then that may be a little different. So the piece that's the lead up to it. So he starts trying to say we need to understand where people are coming from with certain things. And then he's asked by Tucker, how would you assess Winston Churchill? So here we go.
So I do think it's fair to ask, like, what really was going on. So for example, and I'm American, I'm not English, so I don't have any weird motive in asking this, but how would you assess Winston Churchill?
I got in trouble with my podcast partner, Jocko Willink, one time because he's a New England Dutchman whose his family, it's near and dear to they're Dutch, but very near and dear to their heart that Winston Churchill is a hero, right?
Well, everyone
thinks that. He really thinks that. And I told him that I think, and maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic, maybe, but I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities, but I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than.
All right. The stuff he's about to tell you, he leaves things out. Hitler was already occupying 2 countries. Okay? So just remember that as you start listening to this. His position, he tried to give you the just joking there, is that Winston Churchill is more evil than Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and Joseph Stalin. Okay.
Than an invasion of Poland. Or just, at every step of the way, like people are very often, I find, surprised to learn. There's a 2-step process.
Well,
right?
why don't you make the case for that? Okay, so you've made your statement. A lot of people are thinking, well, wait a second. You said Churchill, my childhood hero, the guy with the cigar.
Yeah. Well, and the next thought that comes into their head is that, you're saying Churchill was the chief villain, therefore his enemies, Adolf Hitler and so forth, were
Stalin,
the protagonists, right?
Yeah.
That they're the good guys if you think he's a villain. That's not the case. That's not what I'm saying. Germany, look, they put themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler is chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it, that when they went into the East in 1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that. And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead there. You have like letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now? And so this is like 2 months into the invasion, right? And like my view on this, I argue with my Zionist interlocutors about this all the time with regard to the current war in Gaza. Look, man, like maybe you, as the Germans, you felt like you had to invade to the east. Maybe you thought that Stalin was such a threat, or that if he launched a surprise attack and seized the oil fields in Romania, that you would now not have the fuel to actually respond, and you'd be crippled, and all of Europe would be under threat, and whatever it was, that like maybe you thought you had to do that. But at the end of the day, you launched that war with no plan to care for the millions and millions of civilians and prisoners of war that were going to come under your control.
Okay. They had a plan. It was called the Final Solution. And they invaded with the Einsatzgruppen into the Ukraine, into Czechoslovakia, where they did eventually kill people. And they started with Jews, gypsies, those with mental issues with their mental faculties. That was the most generous way of talking about the Holocaust I've ever heard. Well, we just started a war without a plan for refugees. And X put a community note: civilian deaths in Eastern Europe were not as a result of Germans being overwhelmed by refugees, but rather as a result of a pre-planned strategy of Heydrich's Einsatzgruppen. This is extensively documented in letters, orders, and eyewitnesses reports and photos. I mean, go watch the Einsatzgruppen documentary on Netflix. It's like a 6-part series. It's a tough watch. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. Or read Ordinary Men, which so many people in the last decade, because of Jordan Peterson, have read. Right? I've talked forever. What was the book that I talked about? It was the guy who ended up being the head of Treblinka. He was, let me see if I can look it up real quick. I think it's Into That Darkness. Yes, Into That Darkness, an examination of conscience by Gitta Sereny. They clearly had a plan. It wasn't refugees. It was Jews. So why the generous interpretation of evil? You're not giving the whole story, which you just said was important to do. So let's continue on.
And millions of people died because of that, right? And you can look at it and say, like, So get back to your main question about Churchill. If you go to 1939, when the Germans and the Soviet Union invade Poland, as soon as that war's wrapped up on the German side, Hitler starts firing off peace proposals to Britain and France because they had already declared war. He didn't expect them to declare war, actually. Like, there's a famous scene where he kind of throws a fit when he finds out that they did do that. And so he doesn't want to fight France. He doesn't want to fight Britain. He feels that's going to weaken Europe when we've got this huge threat to the east, the communist threat over there. And he starts firing off peace proposals. He says, let's not do this. Like, we can't do this. And of course, a year goes by, 1940 comes around, and they're still at war. And so he launches his invasion to the west, takes over France, takes over Western and Northern Europe. Once that's done, and the British have, escaped at Dunkirk. There's no British force left on the continent. There's no opposing force left on the continent. In other words, the war is over, and the Germans won. Okay,
by what point?
Fall of 1940, right? So there's literally no opposing force on the continent. And throughout that summer, Adolf Hitler is firing off radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets over London and other British cities, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want to fight you. Like, we don't want to fight you. Offering peace proposals that,
That is true. But who believes Hitler? By this point, he's in Czechoslovakia. He's taken over Austria. He's invaded Poland. He's taken over France. These weren't peace proposals. These were, I have kicked their ass. I'm about to kick your ass. You got lucky at Dunkirk. And be thankful I haven't done it to you, but I will. So surrender and become a client state like Vichy France. Like, this is so outside of reality that I don't understand why. Like, Tucker is a smart person. My dumbass knows these basic facts about World War II. Tucker doesn't know that. So, let's continue on. I mean, these were not peace proposals. These were not serious peace proposals. We have the continent of Europe, and we are extracting their resources. We're an unstoppable force. And there's one person that didn't capitulate. It is Winston Churchill. A lot of his country wanted to capitulate. You had America refuse to help him. There's this great scene in the Churchill movie, Our Darkest Hour, where he's on the phone and Franklin Roosevelt offers him some horses, to pull them up to Canada, and then maybe you could take these tanks, because Congress had said you're not allowed to arm them in any way. FDR eventually finds a way to arm them around Congress's dictate. You had all of the allies, like Belgium, France, Eastern Europe, had been conquered by the Nazis. You had the Eastern Front opened and the Soviets fighting the Germans. But it was Britain alone there for a long start of the war. And it would have been very easy for a lot of people in the British government to just give up. We have no allies. Winston Churchill didn't. And he rallied his people to fight. And then, bit by bit, with the Battle of Britain and other places, they start to fight back. And yes, there are places like Dresden, that are morally reprehensible by the Allies and by Churchill himself. But you're also in the middle of an all-out war of totality, right? So why not put yourself in Churchill's shoes in that situation? Apply your own empathy to a leader and say, well, maybe he had to make these choices, or maybe Truman had to make these choices with dropping the nuclear bomb. Right? That they don't get that same consideration when it's a policy decision that they don't like, that doesn't advance their narrative, which is why it's not honest history. You present the history and let people make up their minds for themselves. And a lot of this has not been honest. Like, did he mean actual refugees, or did he mean that the Holocaust victims were refugees and we just got confused and oopsie? Like, I'm being generous here, but to me it's pretty clear, like, he is talking about, I mean, he's taking the Nazi side and being sympathetic towards them and calling Churchill a guy who decided this was evil and saying, no, we're going to fight and I'm going to badger the Americans until they give in. So there's a lot of victim blaming of the Germans here, which is, I think, fair after World War II, or World War I, I should say, excuse me. But I don't know about the 30s and 40s. There's not a lot of victim blaming. Lucky we rebuilt them. All right, back to the video.
It said, you keep all your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. The world needs Britain to be strong, especially as we face this communist threat and so forth. Like, this is what's going on. And I think that if there were people in Britain who, if they hadn't put it this way, if they hadn't been so successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth, and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland.
Because Neville Chamberlain believed Hitler. Well, he didn't believe Hitler. He knew what Hitler was. And I'll be generous to Chamberlain because it was not politically possible to do what Churchill wanted. And this is the problem with democracies versus totalitarian states. Democracies have to work. They can only work when it's obvious that there's a problem. And even then, you look at Ukraine and Russia. Russia clearly invaded the Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin gave a speech very clearly saying that this territory belongs to us and we're not going to stop. And very clearly is the bad guy in invading Russia after taking Crimea and invading them. And the pretense is that, well, NATO put their nations on our border. Okay, well, you know why you didn't invade those other countries like Estonia? Is because of NATO. And so therefore peace pacts like NATO keep you in check because you have evil intentions. Right, but we're all just supposed to believe the alternative version of history. And there's a lot, and I've talked about this in the show, there's a lot that was done wrong in that Ukraine and Russian relationship. We asked in the 90s and 93 to take all of the armaments from the Ukraine, all the nuclear weapons from the Ukraine, and gave them a guarantee for their security. Foolish. They shouldn't have trusted us. And I guess we have helped, but at what point do Americans say, all right, we fulfilled our duty? And in Russia, Putin wanted to join NATO at one point. He talked to the Bush administration about joining NATO, and the Bush administration brushed him off twice. So we also contributed a lot of the, there's a great book called Who Lost Russia that kind of outlines all this, but we're responsible for a lot of the corruption that led to the oligarchs, that led to the people in Russia being disenchanted and going, well, maybe this system of democracy is just a way for us to get fleeced and we ought to trust this guy because he seems kind of trustworthy. And we helped lead them to their totalitarian state. So there are things when you're making an analysis of a situation where you do have to go, our side isn't always right. There are steps like confiscating the gold. So during the Great Depression, Hoover took all of the gold out of the German banks and brought it back to the United States, which helped lead to the economic collapse in Weimar Germany. There's like a lot of details along the way in the 20s and 30s that led to people looking at Hitler as a viable option. But that does not absolve them of their responsibility for the murder of millions of people. And like, what kind of analysis is that? Is, well, you know, we just didn't plan for all these refugees, so let's kill them. What a crazy statement. Like, he's not trying to, like, I don't know. That's just crazy to me. So here we go. Let's continue on.
That people would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War. You know, we don't, which is not what ended up happening, but that's what everybody thought was going to happen. And so Churchill, I mean, you have a guy Churchill wanted a war. He wanted to fight Germany. And the reason that I don't begrudge him that, you know, people can national leaders, you can fight whoever you want. If
you know why he wanted a war? Because he saw that Hitler wanted to take over the continent and enslave people. And he was against a totalitarian state. And he was the only one with a spine to say it. But your analysis is basically that he just was a war-hungry, crazy person, and there was nothing on the other side that caused him to feel that way. Like, he just was bloodthirsty. There's no reason why he got to that. Like, you're saying the Germans, well, they made these calculated decisions because of these factors, but Winston Churchill, you don't give that same consideration to. That's really weird.
You know, if you feel like your the long-term interests of the British Empire are threatened by the rise of a powerful continental power like Germany, and you need to check that those are great power games, and you play them the way you feel like you need to play them. That's fine. The reason I resent Churchill so much for it is that he kept this war going when he had no way to go back and fight this war. All he had were bombers. He was literally, by 1940, sending bomber fleets to go firebomb the Black Forest, just to burn down sections of the Black Forest, just rank terrorism, you know, going through and starting to.
Do you know who started that particular strategy? It was the Luftwaffe. If you look at the timeline, the Germans were trying to, after Dunkirk, make Britain submit through terrorism. And that's why you ended up with the Battle of Britain. You had Britain return fire en masse as a way to terrorize the German population, to get them to submit. But Goering started it. So, again, he's leaving out a key detail here.
You know, what eventually became just the carpet bombing, the saturation bombing of civilian neighborhoods, you know, the purpose of which was to kill as many civilians as possible. And all the men were out in the field. All the fighting age men were out in the field. And so this is old people, it's women and children, and they knew that. And they were wiping these places out. It was as gigantic scaled terrorist attacks, the greatest, you know, scale of terrorist attacks you've ever seen in world history.
Why would he do that?
Because it was the only means that they had to continue fighting at the time. You know, they didn't have the ability to reinvade Europe. And so he needed to keep this war going until he accomplished what he hoped to accomplish. We know now there's actually a really great series of books. It's one of the best. I recommend it to everybody, but it's really expensive now. And it's 6 long volumes called History of British Special Operations in the Second World War. And one of the books gets into the level of just the extent of media operations, propaganda operations, everything that they were running in the United States to eventually drag us into that war. And that was his whole plan. His whole plan was we don't have a way to fight this war ourselves. This war is over. We need either the Soviet Union or the United States to do it for us. And that was the plan, and kept the war going long enough for that plan to come to fruition. And to me,
this line of thinking is almost directly out of Charles Lindbergh's anti-war rhetoric. If you go back to the anti-war movement in World War II, which was very small, but it was there. It was very intense until Pearl Harbor. But there's a lot of the old right, and I don't mean the old right like Mike Pence and Ronald Reagan. I mean like the old right now, of which Robert Taft Jr. was an influential on Ron Paul. Taft was the last of the old right, a non-interventionist, free market non-interventionist foreign policy. Robert Taft was not in league with Charles Lindbergh, who was anti-Semitic and partly wanted to stay out of the war because he didn't have a problem with the Holocaust. But you had a lot of people saying, look, Churchill's a bloodthirsty monster who's trying to drag us into war. Well, you could at that time, I think that's a very rational position to have. But we have the value of hindsight, which was Japan, Germany, and Italy were bloodthirsty. So the guy who was saying that they're bloodthirsty and you need to fight them before they become too powerful, we need to smother them in the crib, that guy ended up being right. So that's why he becomes a sympathetic figure. It's because he had the courage to say it.
That's just, it's a craven, ugly way to fight a war. And
what was the motive?
The motive was that they had been bombing Britain for 3 to 6 months.
Well, Churchill's got a long and complicated history. I mean, he's somebody who
that was the wryest smile I think I've ever seen.
Yeah. Well, look, I think on one level, there was a sense that Churchill was sort of humiliated by his performance in the First World War as the head of the Admiralty, and he was out in the cold for a long time.
I mean, Gallipoli.
Yeah. And
true. So, see, Tucker knows his history. Not interjecting here.
And which, that was his operation.
Yeah.
I mean, and so he was rightly held responsible for that and seen as responsible for one of the great disasters that the British suffered during that war. And so I think part of it was probably kind of personal. He wanted redemption. He wanted to go out there and prove that he's the warlord that they can go out there and fight this big war. Probably. I think part of it, I read about Churchill and he strikes me as a psychopath. But he's also a sort of, he was a drunk. He was very childish in strange ways. People would talk about how as an adult, as prime minister, they'd find him in his room and he's playing with action figures like war toys and army men and stuff, and would get mad when people would interrupt him, when he was doing this. This is a strange fellow, There's all those things. But then you get into, why was Winston Churchill such a dedicated booster of Zionism from early on in his life, right? And there's ideological reasons. One, in 1920, he wrote a kind of infamous now article called Zionism versus Bolshevism. And he basically makes the case that, which was true to a large extent, that all of Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlement, which is where the vast majority of Jews lived, other than the United States, which is where a lot of them had traveled to, that area had become so engulfed by a revolutionary spirit that all the young Ashkenazi Jews who were over there were getting swept up into it. It was the 60s here on steroids, right? And in a much more serious and ended up being destructive way. And this is 1920, so this is shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution.
Just to correct him, because we've all done it. It was 1919. It was not 1920. So just to tell you a little bit about that.
Basically, the point of his paper is he says these people who are over there, they're all going one direction or the other. They're going to be Bolsheviks. They're going to be Zionists. We want them to be Zionists, and yes. So we need to support this. And so that was early on. There was an ideological component of it.
All right. So that's not true. The actual paper was a departmental minute from 1919, and he was trying to quell riots. So it was actually about using tear gas against rioters. So here's the full quote. I do not understand the squeamishness about the use of gas. We have definitely adopted the poison at the peace conference of arguing in favor of the retention of gas as a permanent method of warfare. It is sheer affectation to lacerate a man with the poisonous fragment of a bursting shell and to boggle at making his eyes water by means of lacrimatory gas. I'm strongly in favor of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes. Problematic in and of itself, right? The moral should be so good, the moral effect should be so good that the loss of life should be reduced to a minimum. It is not necessary to use only the most deadly gases. Gases can be used which cause great inconvenience and would spread a lively terror and yet would leave no serious permanent effects on those most affected. So Churchill's arguing for tear gas, in other words, not deadly gas, and he's not saying we need to use this to convince people to be Zionists. We need you to do this to, I think the summer of 2020, we need to disperse crowds and break this up, against uncivilized tribes. All right, so there's problems there, but that's wholly different than what this guy just said.
But then as time goes on, you read stories about Churchill going bankrupt and needing money, getting bailed out by people who shared his interests, in terms of Zionism, but also his hostility, I think his hostility put it this way, I think his hostility to Germany was real. I don't think that he necessarily had to be bribed to have that feeling. But I think he was, to an extent, put in place by...
So he just said that the Jews bribed and controlled Winston Churchill, so therefore he had Zionist puppet masters. That's what he just said. He actually hated the Germans, so he was racist against their people. But I don't think he was bribed.
By
very slight and sly there.
People, the financiers, by a media complex that wanted to make sure that he was the guy who was representing Britain in that conflict for a reason.
Okay, so Churchill is propped up by the elites in his time so he could become prime minister to fight the war, so he could enrich the bankers. You see where that's going? He just said 2 minutes ago, that he was hated. So which is it? Is the guy an outcast and then he's also loved because of his attachment to these bankers?
And, Churchill's again, it's so hard because and especially in a short interview like this where you have this guy who, he's an Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Martin Luther King type figure in the sort of Western consciousness, right?
Yes.
And so people have so many assumptions and built-in triggers when it comes to this guy that it's hard to talk about him because you're always thinking about the triggers that you're setting off in your listeners. And I don't say that in a way of I don't want to offend anybody.
No,
or whatever.
I understand.
It's that it's that things are going to be misunderstood. And so this is why I do 30-hour podcasts.
Well, it's interesting because I, as a follower of your work, I don't see you as hostile to the West. I see you actually as a product of the West and as a defender really of the West or its values. In your approach, in your open-mindedness, rigor, belief in accuracy and honesty. Those are Western notions. And yet Churchill has been positioned and has been really is accepted as the defender of the West over the last 100 years.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's, and I wonder why that is. People can certainly take issue with any factual claims you're making. I assume they're all right. They're consistent with what I think I know to be true. But why do you think Churchill has been presented in the way that he has?
Yeah, well, it has to do with what you said earlier, right? Neville Chamberlain versus Churchill has been the binary model that has served as the chief rhetorical device for every conflict we've wanted to get into since then.
Yes.
The entire Cold War and then.
That is a good point, actually, because it is true. And so this is documentary thinking, right? So when we have so much of our thinking now in this day and age outsourced to people like the History Channel, you always have this binary thinking of like it's football, like Colts versus the Broncos, right? No, it's much grayer, and there are a lot of things going on between Churchill and Neville Chamberlain, and it's not like this simple, dry, clean-cut thing. But, with the lead up to Iraq, for instance, do you want to be Chamberlain and weak, or do you want to be strong like Churchill? And that, ironically, is a lot of the reason I don't like a lot of the new right, is that appeal to masculinity, that appeal to be strong. It tugs at men to go places that are bad for them, that don't make sense. And it's an emotional appeal that's really manipulative. It's not actually logic and reason, which are very important.
And even after the Cold War, in the global war on terror, is if you appease them, you're Neville Chamberlain. Churchill's the one who saw all along where this was headed and was trying to warn people, this, Cassandra. And finally, because nobody listened to him, the war ended up breaking out, and we were forced to go stamp out this threat. And now It's a much bigger threat than it ever would have been if we just would have listened to him.
If we had strangled it in its crib.
And it's justified every conflict, really since the Second World War. Everybody's the new Hitler, right? And so that it's very valuable in that sense. But then also, it really did become the founding myth of the global order that we're all living in now, right? Because when you think about, if you go back to think about in Machiavelli's The Prince, right? And he starts that book out kind of talking about why he's writing this book. And all
right, I'm going to pause there because we're running out of time, but it is funny because Churchill was more of a nationalist than he was an internationalist, which is part of why he was unpopular. So I don't know how he factors into the birth of the global order, other than winning the damn war for them. So lots of problems there. I mean, how do you talk about the Holocaust like that? That's just crazy. All right, to wrap it up, I just think you should be really careful when you listen to this guy. I mean, that 20 minutes that I just played you, there is just so many problems there, and it's not that he got 1919 confused with 1920. We can be fair on those things, right? It's that there are so many facts left out of this to make Germany look like the victims and Churchill like a perpetrator. And I know that is the purpose of the question, again, to be fair to him. But if your goal is to inform people about the full range of what happened, even in that short amount of time, you chose some really weird ways to put all this stuff. And then you look at what you're doing on X to justify this, which so many people are supporting him saying, well, you're mad, therefore he's right. Which has become a weird thing for the right. I got you mad. I got you emotional. Therefore you're right. I'm not mad about this guy. I'm just not going to listen to him. I'm glad that I got to hear what he had to say because he's on my podcast roster. I like history. I would have listened to him. Now I'm not going to listen to him. I'm not going to associate myself with him because he's clearly got some intentions that, I mean, it's pretty hard not to look at that and go, that's really bad intentions. This is a person who's trying to misinform people. Disinform them. Misinforms 1919 versus 1920. Disinformation is I'm trying to give you selected facts to dislodge your view of the world and appreciate mine more. And then you take into a lot of the stuff that he's been posting on X, he's not he's not helping himself. That's what I'll say. So go check it out. Hopefully you can learn from this and and try to have a your head on a swivel when it comes to this stuff, because it's crazy how people try to push this disinformation. It's every right to say it. He has every right to go on there, and we have every right to go, yeah, this guy's a dangerous actor. Don't listen to him. So that's where we're at. All right. Thank you so much for listening. I am at my studio. I have a podcast studio. I've been recording at my house. Sorry, haven't been there yesterday. I have some sort of stomach issue. I don't know if I ate too much ice cream and my body is rebelling because of lactose intolerance and fatness, or if these people who showed up to a party on Labor Day, oh, we're just getting over the stomach bug, but we're all better now. I don't know if I got what they got. But I'm sitting here. I had nothing to do, and I was like, I need to check in, and this was interesting to me. So, but I feel like death. I feel so bad. But there's no intro music because I've got a different board, and I have a podcast studio called Circle City Studios that you can rent. Podcasters can come in here and rent. We've done a couple episodes here. I need to use it more. I need to book guests to get them in person here. But yeah, so we'll see. Just a matter of making the effort, right? All right. Thanks so much for joining me here on the Chris Spangle Show, and we'll see you again tomorrow.